symptoms.
Let's debate the logic of that, because at first glance, telling doctors not to look for a virus seems incredibly counterintuitive.
It does seem strange.
Why would the highest medical task force in the country actively discourage finding an infection?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, and you look at the macro data, the national logic is actually structurally sound.
How so?
Remember the NHS data. The national average for HSV2 is 15.7%, and 87.4% of those people are completely subclinical. The USPSTF has to weigh the epidemiological benefit of finding those cases against the psychological and financial burden of mass testing.
Let's unpack the psychological burden, because that is a very real medical harm.
It is.
If you run routine blood tests on millions of low-risk, asymptomatic Americans, you are inevitably going to hit false positives.
Of course.
You are going to set a perfectly healthy 22-year-old down in a clinic and tell them they have an incurable, highly stigmatized, sexually transmitted infection. They might suffer severe anxiety, depression, and relationship destruction, all due to a lab error.
Exactly. And even if it is a true positive, if the patient is entirely subclinical and there was no permanent cure to offer them, the task force argues that simply handing them an incurable diagnosis creates massive psychological distress without providing a proportionate medical benefit.
So when the national prevalence is only 15%, the math suggests that blanket screening causes more harm than good.
Right. Okay, I understand the macro math. It makes sense for a suburban primary care clinic in a low-prevalence zip code. But, and this is the massive screaming but of this entire study,
Right.
a national guideline makes sense when the local reality matches the national average. But when an urban emergency department is staring at a 54.4% baseline average and a horrifying 82.8% in a specific demographic, applying that blind national guideline fails the local community catastrophically.
The macro math completely obscures the micro crisis.
Exactly.
I mean, it feels like public health malpractice. You cannot look at a waiting room where 8 out of 10 women over 35 have a virus that triples their HIV risk and say, well, the national guideline says the psychological burden of a blood test is too high, so we shouldn't screen you.
The context completely changes the ethical calculation.
And that is precisely the argument the researchers are making, right?
Yes. They state that local realities must dictate local testing strategies. You cannot apply a broad one-size-fits-all paradigm to the deep urban core. The study forcefully advocates for the creation of an algorithm for targeted HSV2 testing in high-risk populations.
Practically speaking, what does a targeted testing algorithm look like in an emergency department setting?
It means using the multivariate data to profile risk. If a patient walks into the JHHED and they fit the demographic profile identified by the regression model, for instance, an unmarried, unemployed, inner-city, non-Hispanic Black female, the triage protocol should flag her. The attending physicians shouldn't wait for her to complain of an ulcer. They should actively offer and encourage a serologic blood screening for HSV2 while she is already there for her sprained ankle or asthma attack.
But the task force's other argument against testing is that there is no cure. What is the medical utility of diagnosing someone with an incurable subclinical virus? If you can't cure it, why find it?
Because while there is no cure to eradicate the virus from the nervous system, highly effective medical interventions do exist to manage the biological threat.
Like what?
The study specifically highlights the use of suppressive antiviral therapies.
What are these therapies and how do they work mechanically if they don't cure the patient? The text mentions drugs like acyclovir and valacyclovir.
Right. These medications belong to a class of antiviral drugs that act as DNA chain terminators.
DNA chain terminators.
When the herpes virus reactivates and tries to replicate its DNA to create new viral particles, it mistakenly incorporates the acyclovir molecule into its DNA chain.
Yeah.
But the acyclovir molecule is fundamentally broken. It acts like a dead end on a train track. The DNA chain cannot continue growing, viral replication immediately halts, and the outbreak is suppressed.
Oh, wow. So taking a pill every day physically stops the virus from multiplying? How does that impact the public health crisis, though?
It drastically alters the epidemiology. Clinical studies have shown that patients taking daily suppressive valacyclovir experience a massive reduction in asymptomatic viral shedding on their skin.
Right, because if it can't replicate, it can't shed.
Exactly. And if you drastically reduce the viral shedding, you drastically reduce the mathematical probability of transmitting the virus to a sexual partner.
This completely flips the utility of testing on its head.
It really does.
Finding out you have a subclinical case isn't just about managing your own health. It is a vital act of community protection. If the ED can test and identify a fraction of the 87.4% of people walking around Baltimore who have no idea they are infected and get those people on daily valacyclovir, they could theoretically break the chains of transmission across the entire city.
Exactly. Expanding care and getting seropositive patients onto suppressive therapy transforms them from passive vectors into active fire breaks.
Fire breaks, I love that.
It prevents future outbreaks, lowers the localized inflammation that invites HIV, and subsequently reduces transmission across the entire demographic. It is a proactive, aggressive approach to managing a hyperendemic environment.
But taking a daily pill is still just managing a crisis. It requires daily compliance, consistent access to pharmacies, and continuous funding. Suppressive therapy slows the bleeding, but it doesn't solve the structural vulnerability that allowed the 80% plateau to form in the first place.
That's the tragic reality.
The authors of the study point toward a much more definitive ultimate goal, right? What is their final sweeping recommendation?
The study's urgent conclusion, particularly when staring down that 82.8% prevalence in inner-city Black females, is that behavioral interventions, condoms, and antiviral pills are simply not enough.
Right.
The high seroprevalence across all ages and the terrifying flat plateau in the older generations points to the fact that these hyperendemic environments urgently require a biomedical shield.
A shield.
The authors state plainly that high-risk populations, particularly inner-city non-Hispanic Black females, desperately need an HSV-2 vaccine.
An actual vaccine to prevent the virus from ever taking root in the dorsal root ganglion in the first place.
Yes, you cannot simply educate your way out of an 80% prevalence rate when the systemic disadvantages are so heavily entrenched. You need an immunological intervention.
Is a vaccine close?
The scientific community has been trying to develop an effective HSV-2 vaccine for decades. And studies like this one, utilizing the raw, unfiltered data from the urban ED, provide the undeniable proof of necessity.
They prove the need.
They prove exactly how large the market is, how desperate the need is, and crucially, they identify exactly which demographic needs to be at the absolute front of the line the moment a viable vaccine clears clinical trials.
So after dissecting the biology, the statistics, and the public health policies, what does this all mean? What does this mean for you, the listener, especially if you don't live anywhere near Baltimore, Maryland, and have zero connection to this specific hospital?
It's the ultimate question.
Why should you carry the weight of discarded blood samples from an emergency department in 2007 with you? Let's do a final recap of the journey we just took.
Let's do it.
We started this deep dive by challenging our perception of the emergency department. We stopped looking at it as just a trauma center and started looking at it as an unparalleled, incredibly accurate window into the deepest, most invisible layers of urban health. We looked through that window, utilizing the absolute anonymity of identity-unlinked blood serum, and we found a massive silent epidemic. We uncovered an overall prevalence rate of 54.4% for a lifelong virus, a number that completely dwarfs the 15% national average.
Absolutely dwarfs it.
We broke down the multivariate math to find that this burden falls disproportionately and historically on inner-city Black women, plateauing at a terrifying 82.8% for those over 35, exponentially increasing their vulnerability to HIV.
Yeah.
And ultimately, this data proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that broad, one-size-fits-all national health guidelines can catastrophically fail local communities, and that localized, targeted interventions are desperately needed.
And that is the core takeaway for anyone trying to understand public health. Knowledge is most valuable when you critically apply it to the information you consume every day. This deep dive should fundamentally change how you read health statistics in the news. When you see a headline claiming disease X affects 10% of Americans, you must instantly recognize that the 10% is an average.
And averages are smooth blankets that hide jagged reality.
Exactly. Averages mask devastating local extremes. Critical thinking requires you to constantly look beyond the comforting national 15% to seek out the terrifying local 80%. There are pockets of hyper-endemic crisis hiding in plain sight in every major city, obscured by national math.
It completely reshapes how you look at the emergency department's sliding doors. It is a living, breathing laboratory. Which brings me back to the thought experiment we started with, taking the health temperature of a city.
Right.
The specific Johns Hopkins study brilliantly used thousands of discarded blood samples to reveal a massive hidden epidemic of a subclinical virus. But it makes you stop and wonder, What else is floating in those vials right now?
Oh, the possibilities are endless.
What other silent systemic conditions, perhaps biological markers of chronic stress, heavy metal environmental toxins from decaying housing infrastructure, or the invisible early-stage markers of metabolic diseases, are hiding in the thousands of blood samples moving through urban EDs across the country tonight?
It's a profound thought.
If we fully unlocked the emergency department, not just as a trauma center, but as a real-time identity-on-link surveillance network constantly analyzing the remnant blood of the most vulnerable, could we mathematically predict and prevent the next great localized health crisis before a single patient ever even realizes they're sick?
It is a profound and entirely achievable possibility. The biological data is already there, flowing through the laboratory tubes every single day. We just have to build the systems willing to look at it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the averages, keep looking for the mechanisms behind the statistics, and we will catch you next time.